April 14, 1943. Washington, D.C. A signals intelligence officer places a decoded message on a desk in a building whose address does not appear in any public directory. The message is 18 lines long. It contains a precise flight itinerary of Admiral Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, for April 18th. Departure time, route, aircraft type, estimated arrival. The message had been transmitted by Japanese Naval Headquarters in the highest grade cipher available to the Imperial Navy. It had been decoded within hours. The officer who read it understood immediately what it meant. The most important military commander in the Pacific, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the man the Japanese considered strategically irreplaceable, would be in a known location at a known time in a known aircraft with a known escort. He also understood the second thing it meant. If America acted on this information, Japan might realize their highest grade cipher had been broken. And if Japan realized that, everything would end. Not just this operation. Everything. The decision that followed was not made by signals officers. It was made at the highest levels of the United States government. It took 4 days. It was one of the most consequential decisions of the Pacific War. And almost nobody outside the room where it was made knew it had happened at all. This is the story of Operation Magic. It is the story of how a small group of American mathematicians and linguists broke the most sophisticated cipher machine the Japanese government had ever built, 3 months before the attack on Pearl Harbor. It is the story of how that break gave America 3 years of complete visibility into Japanese military planning. And it is the story of the price paid to keep that secret. Paid not in money, not in resources, but in American lives deliberately left unwarned. To understand what was broken, you have to understand what the Japanese believed they had built. The cipher machine, designated Type B by Japanese cryptographers and called Purple by American codebreakers, was a product of years of development by the Japanese Foreign Ministry's Communications Division. It was an electromechanical device that used a series of telephone stepping switches to encrypt messages through a substitution process of extraordinary complexity. The number of possible encryption configurations available to the machine ran into the tens of millions. A message encrypted on Purple and intercepted without the machine, and its daily key settings was, by any reasonable mathematical assessment of 1940, unbreakable. The Japanese were confident in this assessment. Their confidence was not unreasonable. It was wrong. The man who broke Purple was a 36-year-old civilian mathematician named William Friedman. Friedman worked for the United States Army Signal Intelligence Service, a unit so obscure that its entire staff in 1930 had numbered 3 people. By 1940, it had grown to a few dozen. Its budget was smaller than the maintenance allocation for a single Army Air Corps bomber. Its offices were in the basement of the munitions building in Washington. Its existence was not publicly acknowledged. Friedman had been studying Japanese diplomatic cipher traffic since the mid-1930s. He understood, before most of his superiors did, that the problem of machine cipher was not fundamentally different from the problem of hand cipher. It was more complex. It was not more impossible. Complexity was an engineering problem. Impossibility was a mathematical one. Purple was complex. It was not impossible. The analytical method Friedman's team used was the same method that had broken every cipher before it. Find the patterns that mechanical systems cannot avoid creating. A machine, unlike a human, is perfectly consistent. That consistency is its strength in normal operation and its fatal weakness under cryptanalysis. Every mechanical cipher system generates statistical regularities in its output that reflect the regularities of its internal mechanism. Find the regularities. Reverse engineer the mechanism. Reconstruct the machine. Friedman's team worked on Purple for 18 months. The work was done without the physical machine, without any documentation of its design, and without any assistance from Allied services. It was done entirely from the analysis of intercepted ciphertext. In September 1940, the team produced a working replica of the Purple machine built from components sourced from American electronic suppliers that could decrypt Japanese foreign ministry traffic with complete accuracy. Friedman suffered a nervous breakdown from the strain of the work and was hospitalized for several months after the break was achieved. He recovered. He returned to work. he never fully described, in any document cleared for public release during his lifetime, exactly how he had done it. The intelligence product generated by the Purple Break was given the classification designation Magic. Magic intercepts were distributed to a list of recipients so restricted that most senior American military commanders were not on it. The Secretary of State was on it. The Secretary of War was on it. The Chief of Naval Operations was on it. The Army Chief of Staff was on it. The President was on it. Most of the people who commanded American forces in the field were not. The restriction was not bureaucratic. It was strategic. Every additional person who knew that Purple had been broken was an additional risk that Japan would find out. The intelligence was valuable only as long as Japan believed their cipher was secure. The moment Japan changed their cipher system, Magic would end. The distribution list was kept small because the secret was kept absolutely. What Magic provided, from September 1940 onward, was a continuous window into Japanese diplomatic and strategic thinking at the highest level. Not tactical battlefield intelligence, strategic intelligence, Japanese foreign policy positions, Japanese assessments of American intentions, Japanese diplomatic communications with Germany and Italy, Japanese evaluations of their own military situation, and in the autumn of 1941, Japanese communications about a planned military operation in the Pacific that Japanese diplomats were instructed to keep secret from the American government. The question of what American intelligence knew before Pearl Harbor and when they knew it is one of the most argued questions in the historiography of the Pacific War. The honest answer, documented in the post-war investigation by the Joint Congressional Committee on the Investigation of the Pearl Harbor attack, is that American intelligence knew a Japanese military strike somewhere in the Pacific was coming. The intercepts made this clear. They did not clearly identify Pearl Harbor as the target. The intelligence failure at Pearl Harbor was not a failure of the Purple system. It was a failure of distribution, analysis, and imagination. The men who held Magic and did not warn the commanders at Pearl Harbor were not traitors. They were officers trying to protect the most valuable intelligence asset the United States possessed. They believed the attack, when it came, would fall somewhere else. The Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies. They were wrong. On the morning of December 7, 1941, 2,403 Americans died at Pearl Harbor. The Purple system survived intact. Japan had attacked without knowing their own communications had been read for 15 months. The secret held, and the cost of holding it was written in the casualty list from Battleship Row. What changed after Pearl Harbor was the naval side of the cipher problem. Purple was a foreign ministry machine. The Imperial Japanese Navy used an entirely separate cipher system, one that was significantly harder to break. American naval cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Pearl Harbor under Commander Joseph Rockefeller had been working the Japanese naval cipher since 1940. The system was called JN-25. It was not broken in the way Purple had been broken. It was partially read. The cryptanalysts could recover enough text from enough messages to assemble a partial picture of Japanese naval intentions. The picture was partial, contested, and sometimes wrong. But in the spring of 1942, it was enough. In late April and early May of 1942, Station Hypo began intercepting Japanese naval communications that referenced an operation against a target designated AF. Rockefeller believed AF was Midway Atoll. His superiors in Washington, particularly in the Naval Intelligence Office under Captain John Redman, believed the target might be the Aleutian Islands or even the west coast of the United States. The argument between Pearl Harbor and Washington about what AF meant became one of the most consequential intelligence disputes of the war. Rockefeller resolved it with a trap. He arranged for the American garrison at Midway to transmit an unciphered radio message reporting that their water distillation equipment had broken down. Within 2 days, a Japanese intelligence intercept reported that AF was short of fresh water. The Japanese had confirmed the location of their own target by reporting the Americans' own planted information. The Battle of Midway was fought on June 4, 1942. The American carriers were waiting where they should not have been able to know to wait. They knew the size of the Japanese striking force, the rough composition of the fleet, and the planned time of attack. The Japanese knew none of this. The result was the destruction of 4 Japanese fleet carriers the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, in exchange for one American carrier, the Yorktown. The Imperial Japanese Navy never fully recovered from that afternoon. The 6 months of victories that had followed Pearl Harbor ended at Midway, because American cryptanalysts in a basement in Pearl Harbor had spent 2 years learning to read Japanese naval traffic. Rockefort received none of the credit at the time. Washington's intelligence officers, who had been wrong about AF, successfully lobbied to have Rockefort removed from command at Station Hypo within months of the victory. He was reassigned to a dry dock command. He received a Presidential Unit citation for the work at Midway that was held up for 30 years by the same Washington officers who had opposed him and was not delivered until 1985, 19 years after his death. The story of Joseph Rockefort is not the story of Operation Magic. It is a story of what happens to the people inside intelligence systems when the system's internal politics matter more to some participants than the intelligence itself. Rockefort was a man most responsible for the intelligence that shaped Midway. He spent the rest of his career being punished for it by men who had been wrong and could not forgive him for being right. After Midway, the work continued on every Japanese cipher system that could be reached. The Purple Break was still producing diplomatic intelligence throughout the war. The naval systems were partially readable, and the partial reads were producing tactical intelligence of significant value. By 1943, the intelligence product from Japanese communications was informing American operational planning at every level at which such information could be acted on. And then came April 1943 and the message with the flight itinerary. Admiral Yamamoto had been the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet since 1939. He was 60 years old, a graduate of the Naval War College at Etajima and of Harvard University, a man who had spent 2 tours of duty in the United States and who, when Japan was moving toward war in the late 1930s, had argued consistently that war with America was a catastrophic mistake. He had been overruled. After Pearl Harbor, he had prosecuted the war with complete professional commitment, as the officer Japan expected him to be. By April 1943, the strategic situation had reversed. Midway had destroyed the offensive striking power of the carrier fleet. Guadalcanal had been a 6-month catastrophe that ended in Japanese withdrawal in February. The Japanese defensive perimeter was under pressure on multiple axes. Yamamoto had announced an inspection tour of the forward bases in the Solomon Islands to bolster the morale of the men holding the line. Japanese naval headquarters had transmitted the itinerary in encrypted form through normal channels. The encrypted transmission was intercepted by American radio listening stations. It was decoded at Station Hypo and at the Fleet Radio Unit in Washington within hours. By the morning of April 14th, it was in the hands of the officer responsible for deciding what to do with it. That officer was Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. The decision before him was straightforward to state and nearly impossible to make cleanly. Yamamoto's flight itinerary provided the exact information needed to intercept and destroy his aircraft in flight. The P-38 Lightning had the range to reach the intercept point from Guadalcanal. The time of intercept could be calculated from the itinerary to the minute. Yamamoto was meticulous about punctuality. He would be where the schedule said he would be. The problem was that acting on intercept risked revealing to Japan that their highest-grade naval cipher had been broken. If Japan understood what had happened, they would change their cipher systems immediately. The stream of intelligence that had been flowing since 1940 would stop. The counterargument was that Yamamoto was strategically irreplaceable. The Japanese considered him their best naval commander. His death would deprive the Imperial Navy of its most capable operational mind at the moment when that Navy was already under severe strategic pressure. The intelligence value of the Purple System over the remaining years of the war was immense. But Yamamoto's continued existence as the commander of the combined fleet was also something America had a direct interest in ending. Nimitz consulted with his intelligence staff. He consulted with Washington. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox approved the operation. The Roosevelt administration made the final decision. The operation was approved on April 17, 1943. It was given the designation Operation Vengeance. The cover story was prepared in advance. If the operation succeeded and Japan investigated how Yamamoto's route had been known to American forces, The explanation to be circulated was that a coast watcher on the route, one of the Australian and New Zealand civilian volunteers who had stayed behind on Japanese-occupied islands to report on military traffic, had spotted the aircraft and radioed the sighting. It was plausible. Coast watchers have been doing exactly this kind of work since 1942. On the morning of April 18, 1943, a flight of 18 P-38 Lightnings took off from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal in two groups. The first was a killer flight, for aircraft assigned to find and destroy Yamamoto's transport. The second was a cover flight, 14 aircraft assigned to prevent Japanese fighters from intervening. The mission had been precisely timed to the minute, using the intercept's departure and arrival information. The flight to the intercept point took nearly 2 hours at low altitude over water to avoid radar detection. The pilots could not make radio contact or check their positions by normal navigation. They flew by dead reckoning, compass heading in elapsed time, guided by charts drawn from intelligence about the exact flight path the intercept had described. At 9:35 local time, exactly on the schedule derived from the decoded message, a formation of 2 Mitsubishi G-4M bombers and 6 escorting Zero fighters appeared over the jungle coastline of Bougainville. The kill flight was in position. The P-38s climbed from low altitude and engaged. Captain Thomas Lanford, Jr. and First Lieutenant Rex Barber made the first firing passes. The exact sequence of what happened in the following 90 seconds has been argued by historians, veterans, and partisans for the 7 decades since. What is not argued is the outcome. Both Japanese bombers went down. The first, carrying Yamamoto's chief of staff, crashed into the sea. The second, carrying Yamamoto, crashed into the jungle at the edge of the coast. A Japanese search party found the wreckage the following day. Yamamoto's body was found still strapped to the seat, thrown clear of the aircraft, his white-gloved hand holding his ceremonial sword. He had died on impact. Japan announced his death to the public on May 21st, 5 weeks after it happened, in a formal state funeral broadcast. The delay was to allow the announcement to be managed as a controlled piece of national mourning rather than a sudden shock. It did not prevent the shock. Yamamoto had been, to the Japanese public and the Japanese military, the irreplaceable symbol of naval competence in the war they were already beginning to lose. The American cover story about coast watchers was not seriously investigated by Japanese intelligence. The assumption that the communication security of their own naval cipher system might be the explanation does not appear to have been formally raised in the surviving Japanese records of the investigation. The cipher system continued in use. The intelligence continued to flow. Why Japan did not investigate more seriously has been discussed by military historians since the war. The most complete treatment is in James D. Hornfisher's Neptune's Inferno and in John Prados's Combined Fleet Decoded, published in 1995. The conclusion Prados reaches is that the Japanese naval establishment found the Coast Watcher explanation sufficient because the alternative, that their own communication security had been broken, was psychologically unacceptable and intelligence failure on. That scale implicated the entire communications apparatus of the Imperial Navy. It was easy to believe in a lucky Coast Watcher. The intelligence continued to produce throughout the Pacific War. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, where American carrier aviators destroyed 3 Japanese carriers and nearly 400 aircraft in what they called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was shaped in part by advanced intelligence of Japanese fleet movements. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history, was fought with American commanders who had better information about Japanese force composition and movement than any naval force in any previous war had possessed about its adversary. The intelligence did not guarantee American victory at any individual engagement. Battles are fought by men in aircraft and on ships under conditions that intelligence cannot fully predict. American commanders misread intelligence at Leyte Gulf in ways that came close to allowing a Japanese surface force to destroy the invasion fleet off Samar. The men of Taffy 3, the small escort carrier group that found itself directly in the path of a Japanese battleship force it had not been warned about, fought one of the most desperate engagements in American naval history, without warning and without support, but the aggregate effect of 3.5 years of continuous intelligence. Access was an American Pacific campaign that consistently knew more about Japanese intentions and capabilities than any previous naval power had known about an adversary at war. That knowledge shortened the war. IT reduced American casualties below what they would otherwise have been. It allowed resources to be concentrated where they would do the most damage and withheld where the damage would be least. The cost of keeping the secret was never fully calculated, because the costs were not centrally recorded. They were distributed across every decision in which American commanders chose not to act on intelligence that would have revealed the source. Every engagement in which American forces were not warned, because warning them would have required acknowledging how the warning had been obtained. Every operation in which the security of the system was weighed against the immediate operational value of using what the system had produced. William Friedman, who had broken purple in 1940, spent the rest of his life working on communication security for the United States government. He died in 1969. The National Security Agency, which is the institutional descendant of the Army Signal Intelligence Service he had worked for, declassified the formal history of his work on purple in the 1990s. The classified version had been held for 50 years. The replica purple machine that his team had built in 1940 from American electronic suppliers, from the analysis of ciphertext alone, without ever seeing the original device, was examined after the war by American officers who had access to the Japanese originals. The replica was functionally identical to the machines the Japanese Foreign Ministry had used. Friedman's team had reconstructed a machine they had never seen from the patterns in its output. That achievement has no equal in the history of cryptanalysis. In the summer of 1945, as American forces were preparing for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, a planning document was produced estimating expected American casualties. The estimates for Operation Downfall, the invasion plan, ranged from several 100,000 to over 1 million American dead, depending on Japanese resistance and the degree to which the home islands would be defended by civilian forces as well as military ones. The actual invasion was never launched. The atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 and the Soviet entry into the Pacific War produced a Japanese decision to surrender. The intelligence produced by the Purple Break and the naval cipher work had, through the previous 4 years, shortened the war and reduced its casualties significantly below what they would otherwise have been. How much shorter? How many fewer? These are not questions the historical record can answer precisely, because the alternative war, the one that would have been fought without the intelligence, was never fought. What the record does show is that from September 1940 to August 1945, the Japanese Foreign Ministry transmitted its most sensitive communications in a cipher system it believed was unbreakable, and that for the entire duration of that period, American signals intelligence was reading those messages within hours of their transmission. Japan did not find out during the war. The operation remained secret until 1945. The men who had done the work received no public recognition during the war. Friedman's team in the basement of the munitions building worked in secrecy and returned to civilian life in secrecy. The naval cryptanalysts at Station Hypo worked in a basement in Pearl Harbor they called the Dungeon, and came home to a country that did not know what they had done. The official history of the Magic program was declassified in stages through the 1970s and 1980s. The full picture of what had been accomplished became publicly available only decades after the men who had done it were no longer alive to receive proper credit. There is a final detail worth stating plainly, because it is the kind of detail that the official histories tend to lose in the administrative language of signals intelligence reporting. On September 25, 1940, 6 days after Friedman's team produced the first successful decryption of a purple message, William Friedman sent a memorandum to his supervisor reporting the break. The memorandum was 2 pages long. It described the mechanism they had identified, the testing they had performed, and the confidence they had in the result. It was classified at the highest level available and routed to the small number of recipients authorized to receive it. The memorandum contained no celebration, no description of the 18 months of work that had preceded it, no account of the successive failures, the blind analytical paths, the moments when the problem had seemed genuinely insoluble. It stated the result and the method. It was a document of a man who understood that the work was not finished, that the machine kept sending, and that the decryption had continued every day from that point forward for as long as Japan continued to use the system. Japan continued to use the system for 4 years and 11 months. Friedman's team read every message it sent. Japan never knew.